So, Crecganford is back on. So I've grabbed myself a cup of tea
Marvelous. A proper mug. I like that. Thank you very much.
and I
And
have my
chocolate biscuits
McVitie's, which
today.
is now falling on my laptop keyboard. All right.
Fine biscuits
So,
to have with tea.
so
Some
anyway,
of the best.
having a little tea. All right.
I've
So last time
just
we
finished
talked,
mine. So
we talked about a little bit about.
I'm jealous now. I can taste that biscuit from here. What that's going to taste like. Oh,
I'll make sure we're well supplied in April. That way you don't run out. There's like an emergency, like
exactly.
on
It's
demand.
comfort food. Yeah.
I'll make sure I have like a vest stuffed with McVitie's whenever we need one or emergency tea bags. Um, so we're talking about, and funny enough, we just had Irving on. Um,
Mhm.
we're talking about the earliest written sources. So what was the hand? My first question is going to be like, outside of like Mesopotamia and Babylon and the Sumerian language, what other really early known written sources do we have for myths?
In terms of writing, as we would see it, we have to go to India and the Vedas. Uh, but you could argue the Egyptian hieroglyphics are similar. And we know the hieroglyphics probably evolved from cave art and pictures being processed in caves. We see all the way over to West Africa, coming across North Africa into Egypt. And I think that was Dahoy who first saw that. And he saw that as part of his analysis of the Pygmalion myth, which you're familiar with Pygmalion, where you get a sculpture creating a sculpture of a woman he falls in love with. And she turns into a woman, and it's quite interesting because actually, when you look at how the myth spread, you see it not spread in certain places because they don't allow imagery in their culture. So, for example, the Abrahamic faith, and particularly Muslims, the Muslim side of things, don't allow imagery in their culture. You can't draw. You never see a picture. That's why you can't see a picture of Muhammad, but you don't see pictures of Yahweh and the like. They just don't have that. Um, so that's quite interesting. But yeah, really, we have to go to India for those writings, and then that goes. We see then a combination of input from the Near East and India going into Iran and Persia, where it then filters and slowly filters west into Greece and the like. So that's what I mean. You see, so we get those, and because of that, we also see that's how many myths then migrate. We see myths seem to be influenced in Europe from the East because of that.
Okay.
Caught you mid biscuit. Sorry.
I know. Well, I'm eating the biscuit. All right. Uh, so what do we have for our earliest Egyptian source?
Then hieroglyphs. You've got things like the Book of the Dead, they call it, which explains funerary rites. But there's all sorts of stories we see and uh, about how things happen, how taxes are paid, how pyramids were built. There's things there. So people often say we don't know how the pyramids are built. There are hieroglyphs that give us some indication of how some of them were built. Um, so yeah, it's those. But what we do see is a variation of myth all the way up the Nile, much like we were talking about earlier about different tribes have different myths and they vary based on the environment. We see sort of creation myths evolve and change, which tend to be the earliest myths we have, like why are we here? How was this created? Um,
And
and
do we see
probably
a commonality, like this Earth Mother, Sky Father thing, or
no, there's a couple of types of myth. We have sort of the Earth diver type myth where the world is water and then something dives down and brings up land. But then we see that evolve. And probably the most popular myth was the one involving Ptah, where he creates a mound and on the mound he puts an egg and the egg then gives birth to the cosmos. Yeah, and those things. And then we see that egg sort of metaphor of how the world creates spread places on, alongside the earth diver myth. And the earth diver myth eventually turns into the flood myth. And we see that change, and then we see aspects of that go into the Americas. And as it goes into the flood myth, and we see stories about the earth being formed on a turtle and on pillars and on mountains, and that comes from people coming from the ground. So where we see creation myths where people come from the ground, they often come out through a tree, and we often see the tree being used as a way of separating the earth from the sky, in these myths. And we eventually see that these trees get bigger in myth, and say, or the mountains are used. These turns into the pillars. We often see a myth of keeping up the night sky, and they turn into things like the turtle, or like a way of holding up, separating water from the sky. And that's actually quite common in Japan as well. We see copies of myths where there is a separation of earth and the water through something floating.
Lovely. Very lovely. Okay. Now, is this would this create the world tree kind of, or be foundations for a world tree? Not necessarily a world tree, but like
World tree, yeah,
life,
that's it.
light tree of life
Like,
thing.
yeah, tree of life, because people talk about the tree of knowledge and the tree of life, and there's sort of different types of tree. But yeah, the tree of life is a tree we associate with people coming from it, the very first people in the early myths, and that becomes sort of the tree of life, which is different to the tree of knowledge, which is if you eat, you lose your immortality, which is more about the giving of an apple or giving of food rather than the tree itself. Um, yeah, but and you see that tree aspect then evolve. Probably one of the most famous ones is in Norse mythology, within Old Norse, where we see the Yggdrasil, and that, yeah. And to be honest, we don't exactly know what that is, because how it's called, its name, we don't really fully understand it. It feels like it's been simplified. So Yggdrasil means sort of Odin's horse, but actually that seems like a poetic simplification of what it should have been called, which is um, Odin's horse, which doesn't make sense. Um, but we see this a lot. So we see it in Fenrir. So where we talk about Fenrir's brood, we're talking about the puppies of Fenrir. And so people think Fenrir is a wolf, because we all talk about Fenrir in Volaspol, where he eats Odin. But actually, Fenrir is Loki. That was Loki's name. But through poetic simplification, Loki's the friends talk about Fenrir's brood. They associate Fenrir with the brood rather than Fenrir as Loki, who fathered the brood. So, and we have that with the Yggdrasil. But we don't really quite understand why we have that simplification and what that could then have meant. And there's some really interesting ideas about that. But
And so this is purely off of Norse, correct?
that's the old Norse, yeah, one on their tree of life, yeah.
Okay. Now, can
Well, they
we?
call it tree of life. It's just a tree of the cosmos bringing things together. But yeah.
Okay. Now, are there other cultures, if we were to backtrack from the Scandinavian area and go back down towards Egypt, going in reverse order? Do we see other tree of life?
That's right. We see the Irminsul in Germanic culture, so that's probably 1,000 years earlier than the Old Norse, uh, which we believe is represented by a tree, and we know that because we see talk of the Irminsul being chopped down through Charlemagne's
Chris,
progress
way
of
to really get out.
Christianity. Yes, basically genocide, for want of a better word to call it.
And Chris Lee
Um,
wrote a really good album about it.
yes. But if we go back, the tree of life in Greek, where we have stories, they were actually converted into the pillars. So we see I think it's the 7 pillars of creation or whatever. That's in effect an evolution of the tree of life. We also see trees in imagery in other Near Eastern myths. I'm less familiar with those, but I'm familiar with the trees being there. But I think the tree of life is very specific to creation myths rather than trees generally having I guess, bringing up a certain thought process within a mind in a story, because they're big and strong and tall. They can have multiple things applied to them. So, whilst the trees are I guess, a significant symbol in myth, the tree of life has a specific place in creation myths, and really, so we see them in basically as a way where people come from, and as I said earlier, push the sky away from the ground to create the space where humans can be. As really the purpose of it. I'm not familiar with it being in any Egyptian creation myths, but there again, I'm not an Egyptologist. But certainly the creation myths I'm aware of in certainly Egyptian myths in the last 6,000 years, I don't recall any mention of it in that. So it seems probably it's more of a Near Eastern thing. In fact, probably earlier than Near Eastern. It may have come out of Africa into Eurasia and just lost in the Near East because of the agricultural revolution and other things happening, and therefore trees maybe have lost some of their importance in the world where you would want to be associated with nature, but now you're associated with agriculture. You're more worried about irrigation and rainfall rather than trees. So, and it could be that, because we then see that tree go in some myths, some very later, but still early creation myths, the tree where it drops fruit, that fruit becomes land in the sea. So the tree sort of evolves. At the same time, we see the creation myth of the earth diver turn into the flood myth. And that's almost certainly because we see the cultures telling that myth not being by the sea. So there's probably a lack of, I guess, awareness of, or they can apply the myth to what they are seeing in their environment. So it changes that, where does this water come from? It must be a flood. And then rather than, and the duck goes down and gets surf and brings it up, or eventually turns into a dove and flies off and grabs a branch from a tree and comes back and says, "Oh, land is here." Mm-hmm. So you see it sort of evolve from the tree of life into sort of other aspects, but still involving the creation of land. But that's it as far as I'm aware. I don't unless there's myths being told in the Americas, like South America, which are different. I'm Oceania. I think that's the limits of my knowledge on the tree of life that I know of, in terms of how it's dispersed and its evolution.
Lovely. Lovely. It's like a whole class right there. A whole lot of information to
if
take
people are interested
8:30 in the morning.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would recommend, if you wanted to read about that, Michael Witzel, who's the professor of Vedic studies at Harvard, written a great book on the world's oldest mythologies, which I think talks about that in more detail, although it is quite broad. So, but it's certainly a good starting point if people are interested in learning more about that.
Okay. So how switching from like a hunting gatherer to it was interesting when you were talking about how agriculture became more important. So in what ways how did agriculture suddenly change uh, creation myths?
Okay, so it changed religion, it changed gods, it changed everything. So what we find is pre-agriculture, religion tended to be animistic. We're at one with nature. Everything we need in nature, has a consciousness and feels like us. Everything's at one. But when agriculture comes along and people settle down, their environment changes. So their environment changes from being in nature to being in a settlement with people, and their needs change to wanting their crops to grow, which rely on water and sun. And so what we find is that actually we start seeing the personification of gods. So we see gods actually take a human shape, which is why we start seeing these figures of Marduk kind of like in the Near East, in Mesopotamia. And what we find is that then the stories change such that there is still like a chaotic sea in their creation myths. In the Enuma Elish, you have the sea, and in the sea there are these two serpents, in effect, or there's actually two types of water. So when they talk about Tiamat and Apsu, they're talking about fresh water and salt water. They're talking about the rivers, the Euphrates, going into the Persian Gulf. And we actually know that because when he starts talking about other sort of their siblings, they're actually using terminology relating to the waters of the deltas where the Euphrates go into the Persian Gulf. There's a sort of actual cognates there with the words. So obviously the river and water is still significant in that. But in terms of creating land, what changes is that rather than a duck goes down, people control the water. The god controls the water, controls the sea, and from that builds land. So basically they capture Tiamat, which means the deep, and behead her, split her into two, and create the earth and the firmament. That's where we live. So the creation myth has changed significantly at that point, but still revolves around water. But then what we also see is stories about dragons, which have been going on for a long, long time, also change with water. So before we had agriculture, dragons were considered the creatures that created the world and brought good to the world and brought water to the world. So we see this in the rainbow serpent of Australia, where the world is dry, the rainbow serpent comes along and it rains and things come out of the ground, people come out of the ground, and that's how life is. We see that in the rain snake in South Africa too, sort of a similar kind of story. But what we see when agriculture comes along is that actually, no, the dragon isn't giving us water anymore. Our crops must be dying. That's how I see it. That there must be stories. Why aren't we getting rain? It must be the dragon not giving us it. Let's ask a god to kill the dragon in the sky. And when the god kills the dragon, there's a thunderstorm and it rains. And so that seems like the god has obviously done what the people wanted by killing the dragon, made all this noise, and it's raining, and they get their water. And then from that, we also see stories involving the seasons. So when there is a drought and they want rain, the other thing that people look at is journeys to the underworld myths. We see there's multiple myths around this. The famous one probably is the Greek one, Persephone, but we see others where even in there you get Adonis going down into the underworld briefly. And it's felt that these are trying to explain the seasonal changes in the environment. You know, like why is there sun all the time and no rain, or why is it always raining? There's no sun. Why does it go from summer to winter? Obviously, the gods that are controlling these things have disappeared somewhere for a brief period of time to do something, and will come back. And so they create stories around this. And so, yes, the whole aspect of myth and stories and how a pantheon exists to represent each of these problems they're having and how they're personified seems to me to come from the settling of peoples to create an agricultural environment. And that takes time. So this didn't happen overnight. I mean, agriculture, whilst we see it delivering probably 80% of the food necessary by 10,000 BCE in the Near East in certain places, it took us probably 10,000 years to get to that point. I mean, 20,000 years ago, we were eating grasses, but it slowly we started to realize that actually we could grow these grasses in a particular way or put them in a place, and slowly they went from being sort of 1 or 2% of our food source to 5% to 10% to 15%. But that took, say, 10,000 years to get there. So all through this time, there's, you know, the stories get a chance to change. What we are really lacking, though, is an understanding of that change. There's very little in the archaeological record to help us. We see things like Göbekli Tepe, which has some carvings and some things there, but we've got no context in which to put it to understand how it's going, how we went from sort of the hunter gatherer myths we told because we can see these myths told across a vast landscape. And this is what the things I do with phylogenetics. We get these myths and we get to see, oh, there's so much commonality in these myths and they grow in such a way that follow dispersals and migrations and the like. We can be confident that these myths are old and from a source versus these new myths in the Near East that we say we've got no record of how they came to be apart from what I just said. There's no, we can't see the evolution from the old hunter gatherer myths into this. So in effect we are making some supposition here. We're sort of guessing, but it does seem to be a logical and highly probable cause for that change. And I don't know if that answered your question, but that's hopefully that did what religion basically changed 10,000-12,000 years ago, with the personification of gods, and I'll tell you that because of the settlements and agriculture and the different needs we had, and because myth is shaped by environment and social needs.
Yeah, gives a great amount of information. In addition, one question I get in my head that I always either forget to ask or don't have enough time to ask people. The lightning and the thunder aspect when the god fights the dragon, when we get into the lightning and thunder aspects of these myths, is there any talk about what that actually is?
Yes. So it depends on your culture, but in the Vedic, so in India, West India, that is Indra's swords clashing with the dragon, the lightning.
Okay.
And the thunder's the clashing as well. So it's all that is the actual fight happening. And that makes sense because if the fight is happening and Indra's winning, which he would have to be, because it'd be raining at the time, thunder and lightning, you hope, that's why the dragon is giving up the water. So so that was the reason for it. And then that sort of makes sense. I mean, I've talked to a number of people about this, where if you go into the wilderness, which is very hard to do in the UK, if you're lucky enough to go to into the forest of Germany or certainly in America, and you're on your own, in nature, nothing around you, and it's night time, and there is a major thunderstorm. That sound, that power is just it's a sound it's very hard to replicate. In any other way, that feeling and the atmosphere and the smell. We still have genetics in us that can sense when rain's about to happen because that's important to us. Some people are very much, and certainly
Your
animals.
survival mechanism. It's a survival mechanism.
Yeah.
You can tell barometric pressure changes.
So it really is interesting how important that is and those things. But certainly, as I say, there's a significant thing that allowed stories to be told, and it sounds like one of the easiest things to tell stories about. I mean, I remember my parents used to say, "Oh, that's a giant walking on the clouds when it thundered." And as a small child, for some months, I'd be embarrassed to say how long I actually believed that, but for a while, I obviously thought there was a giant, walking around on the clouds. Before I realised now that couldn't work because it'd fall through the clouds and die on the ground. So, but that's how myths start. That's why heaven in the clouds sometimes it's all magic happens up there because you can't see beyond it.
Yeah. So I'm curious, does anyone ever talk about what happens if you get struck by lightning and live?
That's interesting. I cannot recall that. Possibly because the people who get struck by lightning often weren't around to tell the story of what it felt like. I'm not saying it always happens, but you got to suggest there is a high mortality rate of such things happening before the times of medicine and the like.
Yeah.
So I don't think there'd be too many. It's like, what's it like to be eaten by a snake or a shark?
No,
People
I
don't live to tell
understand.
us.
But I
But
didn't know
no,
if
I
that
don't
meant like,
recall any myths about so and so was hit by lightning.
Yeah.
because
I didn't know if it was like you survived the wrath of the gods or
only oak trees we see. So the name of the god of the thunder god, for want of a better word to call him, of Europe is was Perkinus, or cognates of Perkinus, which basically means an oak tree struck by lightning. Because it seems like oak trees were susceptible to being catching fire and being struck by lightning. So that's probably so. There was that was recognised in the environment, and so much so that it became the name of the god across pretty much all of Europe, apart from Scandinavia, where Thor isn't really cognate with that. Although Fjorgyn, which is a name of Thor's son, I believe, although I think there's a couple of Fjorgyns actually, that is cognate with Perkinus through linguistic change in which I'll talk about in another video. It's very complicated. And Anatoly Lieberman's written a really great article about that in his Prayer and Laughter book. But yeah, so it's so important. It was really important in Europe that, or really well known, that lightning causes oak trees to catch fire. But that's about it as far as I'm aware in terms of lightning strikes.
yeah. Interesting. Um, very, very interesting to think about. Uh, now, when we get into dragons a little bit, um, so in your one video, which I'm going to leave in the description, talks about the lengthy. I'll put it like the length of all of the myths out there that talk about dragons. Um, and I recommend that people should probably pause right here and then go check it out and come back. Um, but there's so linguistically, some of them are also just referred to as worms.
Yes, so an old word for dragon is worm, absolutely, and worm is one of the oldest words we know of that has existed. So it's certainly is tens of thousands of years old, because we see cognates of it going into the Americas as well as in Europe and Asia. So yes, so the talk of this serpent, this snake-like creature, this dragon, yeah, has been around that long.
Okay. Now, is there a variation in the meaning to these words when we go from worm to dragon or to snake or
Yes.
winged serpent?
Well,
Does it change? Does
it's
the
in the
word
eye of the beholder, I would say. So, in the sense that dragons used to look like chimeras, sort of, which were sort of like winged lions with a bit of scaliness to them, but they also look like snakes. Um, so, and the dragons of China had sort of some human features. Dragons of the Near East were more serpent-like. So it really does depend on who's telling the story and what they mean. Um, and certainly in England, our dragons only had two legs compared to sort of Europe's four-legged dragons. So there was all different, associations what dragons look like, and it's one of the things that actually really got me into mythology. I was at an exhibition in the National Gallery in London on St George and the Dragon, and people tell me all the time, "Oh, dragons are dinosaur bones." People see dinosaur bones and they thought of dragons. Well, actually, that's nonsense. And one of the reasons it's nonsense is if you look at any painting of artwork pre-Victorian times, when dinosaurs were started to be discovered and dragons became big. Before then, dragons were like frogs and toads, or they were creatures no bigger than a horse, probably more like a big pig or something. That's what I thought dragons were. So yeah, although there were some snake type things that we've seen in Asian art, but yeah, there certainly weren't these big monstrous beings we see, in fantasy games and fantasy films now. That is a very much a modern take on it, much like horns on Viking helmets. Thank the Victorians for skewing the modern day view on what they are. But yes, no, it's pretty much a nonsense as far as I was aware that dinosaurs influenced these myths of dragons, for all these thousands of years.
Okay. Very fascinating that is how it's changed.
Yeah, the Victoria, yeah, because we're doing the Victorian period. In fact, it's quite interesting on mythology generally. So, I mean, before probably the 1700s, mythology wasn't really a subject. No one really thought about it, and certainly even going back into Roman times, and that they really didn't think of any myths as being myth. That they call, I think they call them fabulae, like the fabulous, fantasy. Um, and we actually see the meanings of the words mythos and logos in Greek, meaning different things, are not necessarily meaning myths as we know them. So the establishment of myth is literally something that's happened in the last 250 years, and with that, and the Victorians period's creativity that came with it, and as education became more widespread and people could write and read, and yeah, they developed these ideas of what the world was like in a visual format that was the first time people had seen these things, and they have stuck with us for those obviously 200 years. So many of the things we perceive of fantasy creatures looking like tend to have only been created in the last 100 to 200 years, and just stuck with us.
I love it.
Well, it's frustrating because some people are so convinced by this imagery that it's really hard to argue with that. No, that isn't how these things were, how these things were shaped. Roman soldiers didn't dress like this, and Robin Hood didn't wear tights, and all this sort of stuff. There's these things. Yeah, it's frustrating, but yeah, it's why we do what we do to try and educate people.
Yeah, yeah, it's fascinating because they kind of open the door for things like this to happen, but at the same time, they also created the some of the nonsense we're still dealing with to this.
Exactly. Yes, they raised awareness, but also, you know, muffled that awareness of confuse us.
They
So,
caused both the solution and the problem at the same time.
yes, and you get that nowadays. You get that with people like Graham Hancock, who's a marvelous storyteller. Um, but within his stories there are some truths, but I feel he sometimes often mixes that with things that aren't truth, and so people walk away with these ideas of Atlantis and the pyramids that just aren't true, although they have speckles of information that may be accurate. So it's still happening today because
Yeah,
people like that. People, I don't know what it is, but they like a good story. I guess it is, and the made up mythical stories with a layer of fantasy appeal to people more than the drab stories that you read in ancient texts,
yeah.
which really are full of metaphor and colourful characters, really in the same way we read today.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's a lot of it's very dry material. I mean, even I'd find the more entertaining myths to kind of be towards the Irish myths, and even then, those are
Yeah,
dry because of
yeah,
how undescriptive they are.
exactly. Yeah, and I do try and make them a bit more contemporary when I put them in my videos. I try and get that source material and sort of retranslate it, so to speak, reinterpret it to make it a bit more enjoyable. Because as I say, some myths are just don't make sense. They're really quite, Bob went out hunting with his big bow, which was um, really important to the village, and he killed a deer, and everybody was happy. That's the story, and it's like, well, what does that mean? And you have to
Why a
try and
big bow?
translate it. Well, what the big bow meant, and actually, there's some meaning behind that. But that's the thing that is lost in interpretation. That cultures have words for things that just don't translate into English. Not
Hmm.
definitely don't translate into English literally. And narratively, it's very hard sometimes to make those translations, and that's why I always say to people, if there's an interesting source book they want to read, let's say like the Poetic Edda for Old Norse, a lot of people are familiar with that. In buy at least two versions, if not three or four versions of different authors, and read how they translate the lines differently, and then you get an idea. You'll get a better idea of actually what they're trying to say.
Yeah. Huh. Great big mystery of myth understanding.
Hmm.
Ciphering. It's like a language within a language.
Yeah, well, yes, it is. I mean, just think of all the terms you use as an American, you know, that maybe us English wouldn't get.
Yeah, or all the just the other oh man, just yesterday. I'm not even sure if I'd be allowed to say it on YouTube, but just the term this one British woman came in at this place I was working at, and I was at a complete loss for words because of the term she was using for her Hershey's chocolate kisses.
Okay,
And
yeah, so they were like that. Yeah, like the word fanny or something. Yes,
yeah,
so to us that is quite a rude word,
yeah,
but to you it's not so.
yeah. Well, we have something
But
called a fanny pack because it.
exactly. So if you saw a text that said like something to do with the fanny, you would translate that in American different to as we would translate it in English if we were translating it narratively. But if we were translating literally, we would both say fanny. And then it's up to the reader to try and work out what that means. But as an academic, you don't want the reader to necessarily have to go through that process. You want to try and unravel it. But then if that what we often find in the ancient texts is their poetry. So if you're now trying to do a narrative translation of a poem, the poem stops being a poem because it turns into this long, complicated sentence of trying to explain what this word meant in that language because it has there's so much meaning stuffed within it that you lose the sort of poetry. So yeah, it's a very tough ask to translate some of the old text. So I have full respect for those who do. A lot of people get given a hard time for some of the translations, but it is a balance between keeping the poetic nature of some of these texts versus letting them tell you what they exactly meant to mean.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a good note to end this interview on, John.
Okay, then, Garrett, it's been a pleasant chat.
It has been a
As
pleasant chat.
always, yeah, just like it's pretty casual and just dotting around places, and hopefully, we're learning things as we go.
Yeah.
So thank you.
I think people watching will learn a lot from this one too. All right.
Cool.
Thank you again, John. Happy New Year.
Have a new year, Garrett. You take care.